Chas Kohanim Vayedaber Adonai al Moshe Lemar Daber Larav Abanav Lemar Kesevaruchus B'nei Yisrael Amar Lahem Yevarechecha Adonai v'Yishmerecha Yoer Adonai Pana V'Lecha V'Chuneka Yisa Adonai Pana V'Lecha V'Yasem Lecha Shalom V'Samoy Shemiah B'nei Yisrael V'Ani Avarachem. I'd like to thank the sponsors for this week's Kiddush, the Kiddush that will be served tomorrow. The Sonnenbergs are sponsoring in honor of their grandson's Evan's birthday. Happy birthday, Evan. And the Johnson family is sponsoring on the occasion of the 50th yahrzeit of Shira's father, Yaakov ben Meir Halevi. You should have a lichtig Gan Eden. You should go higher and higher in the heavenly worlds. The name of this week's portion is Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. Yet in reality, only the first verse talks about the life of Sarah, talks about Sarah being alive, because it's the portion that opens with the passing away of Sarah and the burial of Sarah. And even the first verse that talks about in the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. These are the years of the life of Sarah, is immediately focusing that she passes away in the city of Kiryat Arba, which is in the city of Hebron, which is part of the land of Canaan. And Avram came to eulogize Sarah and to mourn for her. And the portion then goes on to chronicle the passing of Sarah, the negotiations for the purchase of the cave of Machpelah, the burial place, which is a holy site in Eretz Yisrael till this very day. If you have ever go to visit Israel, you should definitely make your way to the city of Hebron and visit the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah are buried, where Isaac and Rebekah are buried, where Jacob and Leah are buried. The Torah then goes ahead and talks about the marriage of her son Isaac and his new wife Rebekah. She now takes the place of Sarah. So the name of the portion is the life of Sarah, but yet it's not about her. It's about what comes after the passing of Sarah. And yet we know that the name of a portion is supposed to be a symbol of what the entire portion is about. And so to really understand the meaning of the name of this portion, we're going to take a look at this week's Haftorah, the Haftorah that's read this week. And it comes from the opening chapter of the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings tells us the story of the history of the Jewish people from the time of King Solomon's reign until into the period of time where the Jewish kingdom is divided in two, and then there's the exile of the northern kingdom. All of that is the focus of the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings follows the Book of Samuel. The Book of Samuel is the account of the beginning of the monarchy of the Jewish people. It begins with King Saul and later with King David. And this opening part of the Book of Kings is this transition from the Book of Samuel to the story of King Solomon. And it opens with King David. The Book of Kings opens with Hamelech David and King David, Zokein Baba Yamim. He was getting old. He came into his old age. Now, King David is no doubt one of the most passionate, lively of all biblical personalities. And the verse is telling us, well, it was slowing down. He was getting old. The ravages of time and age was taking its toll on King David. And this one dynamic leader is now reduced to a picture of passivity. He's beginning to wane down. But before he passes away, of course, the thoughts are going to be all around the court of who's going to take over, who's going to be the next king. He's aging. And obviously the focus on his family, on his children. And rumors start spreading throughout the palace, throughout the courtyard. And then the text from the Book of Kings tells us what's going on. King David had a son. His name was Adoniah. He was one of the children from his wife Chagis. He was a brother of Avshalom, who was David's oldest, who was a very charismatic son, who led, unfortunately, a rebellion against his father in his father's lifetime, and he was unfortunately killed in the process of that revolution. So now Adoniah, his second, he's a handsome fellow, And he obviously believes that the throne belongs to him. And now that his father is aging and his father has slowed down, he begins to take a proactive approach to succession, to secure succession for himself. So he declares himself that he is the future king. And he makes some moves to cement this claim. And the book of King tells us that he forms a personal guard with chariots, with horsemen, with 50 servants that will run in front of him. These are signs of royalty. And meanwhile, he begins to test the waters in the royal court. He starts garnering support for his bid for the throne. And he starts going to members of the priesthood, particularly someone named Avi Asar. He gets his loyalty. And in an enormous coup, he gets Yoav. Yoav was King David's nephew, and he was the military commander. And he gets Yoav to join his claim to succession that he will be the next king. Now, the book of Kings tells us that there were some holdouts. There were some people, the high priest Tzadok refused to go along with it. The prophet Nassan refused to go along with it, the prophet Shimei. But Adoniah is putting together a very, very powerful team of people to make the claim that he will be the next king. And in fact, that he is king. And at some point, Adoniah decides it's time to go public, to put out the press release, to get the media to make the announcement, to take his royal candidacy to the people by bringing his contention for the throne into the open. This way he could begin to gather the popular support he's going to need from the people to become the next king. This would cement his place, that no one else from the house of David is even going to make an attempt, being that the top members of King David's cabinet has already endorsed him, the people have endorsed him. And that's what he's doing to secure that he is the next king. And so he prepares this enormous feast. And the book of Kings gets into the details. He slaughters many sheep and cows and oxen to serve. And he invites all of his supporters, as well as his brothers, his potential rivals for the throne, for them to see that, hey, he's got it. He's got a lock on it. The king's loyalists, King David's loyalists, were not invited. The king himself, King David, was oblivious that this whole thing was even going on. He didn't even know it was happening. The problem was that King David was still alive. He was still the king. He didn't pass away. That's problem number one. Problem number two was that King David had already promised the throne to someone else. Years earlier, the prophet of the time, his name was Nassan, had declared that the future of the monarchy will go to Solomon. Solomon was a son from his wife Bathsheba. And King David promises Bathsheba that her son Solomon will be the next king. So we have that King David is still alive, so there is no room to declare Adoniah the king. Secondly, King David himself has appointed someone else. And yet all of this is going on in the capital, in the royal city. Nassan, the prophet, understands that once Adoniah would seize the throne, there was a risk that he would purge the royal court of any potential rival. And he was afraid for the life of Bathsheba and the life of King Solomon. And therefore, he calls them together and he says, we have a crisis. He informs Bathsheba of what's going on, that there's a coup going on, that the generals, the military have already joined him, and we have a threat here. And we have to have a smart plan of action. And so they come up with a plan. And first Bathsheba comes into the king's chamber. And she makes her case. And she tells the king, are you aware that Adoniah has declared himself the king? And you, my dear husband, you promised me that Shlomo, my son, will be the next king after you. And here Adoniah has already declared himself the king. Did something change that I am not aware about? Did you have a change of heart? And at that very moment, Nassan enters the room, and Nassan too. They actually planned this. They obviously planned this before. But Nassan says, King, are you aware, Your Highness, that there's a party going on right now, hosted by Adoniah, who's declaring himself the future king? Was there a change in plan that I, the prophet, I'm not aware of? Vayan Hamelech David. The verse says, and David answers. And he says to Bathsheba, and he says to the prophet, Vayishava Hamelech, he swears. And he says, Chai Hashem asher podos nafshi mikol tzora. He swears in the name of God who has spared me and redeemed me from all my tzoras. And he says, Ki Shlomo bincha yimloich acharai. It will be that Shlomo, my son, will be the next king. And he will sit on my throne after me. When Bathsheba hears these words, Vatikod Bathsheba Sheva Apayim, she bows 7 times to the earth in front of the king, and she yells out, Yechi Adoni Hamelech David Li'olam, which means, may my master, King David, live forever. And so it was. Immediately by the king's decree and his strength of his statement that the throne belongs to Shlomo HaMelech, he let it be known throughout the royal household that Adoniah is not going to be the king, but Shlomo HaMelech, Shlomo, will be the next king. Word reaches Adoniah himself that so the king said, and unlike his brother Avshalom, who led a rebellion against his own father, immediately Adoniah says, if this is the words of my father the king, then Shlomo will become the king. And Shlomo and Adoniah have this treaty amongst them that there will be no fighting, and Adoniah accepts Shlomo HaMelech as the king. I want to focus, however, it's a fascinating story. I want to focus on that last line of Bathsheba. She says, may my master, Lord King David, live forever. What does she mean, live forever? Here she is talking about who's going to be the king after you die. So why doesn't she say, may my son, King Solomon, may his reign go on? Why does she say, may my Lord, King David, live forever? If she really believed that King David was going to live forever, then there's no discussion to have if it's Adoniah or Solomon. It's going to be King David. She's blessing him that he lives forever. Does she really think he's able to live forever? And if so, there's no succession to talk about. Moreover, we have that just a few lines later, once King Solomon is anointed and officially approved for succession, his supporters yell out, while King David is still alive, Yechi Hamelech Shlomo, may King Solomon live. So they're already calling him by the name, the king, while David's alive, with the approval of King David, but no longer is it Yechi HaMelech David, that David should live, now it's King Solomon should live. And with this, we will understand why this week's portion is called The Life of Sarah. From the message of what Bathsheba in her the declaration and her blessing that King David should live on forever. You see, Solomon was the child who most embodied the values and the ideals and the virtues of his father David. And so what Bathsheba was saying is, by you declaring Solomon to be the next king, you have secured that you indeed, David, will live on forever, because you will live on through him. You'll live on even after your passing. The people might change, their personalities may vary, but the throne would be the same. The mission statement of the throne, the belief system, the engine behind the monarchy will be the same. David, King David, was a servant of God, and he understood that his mission as a king is to fulfill his duties to God and to inspire his subjects to live up to their full God-given dignity and potential. And so it would be with King Solomon, and therefore King David lives on. So when they declared, long live Solomon the king, this wasn't a contradiction of Bathsheba's proclamation, let my master King David live forever. It was one in the same, because if Solomon lives, David lives. Solomon saw himself as an extension of King David, not one that wanted to change anything, not one that wanted his own reign. All he wanted was to continue the work of his father, King David. So when Solomon becomes king, he prays to God that he merit to follow the path of his father David. So long as Solomon is the king, David's alive. So long as the kingdom of David is there, David is alive. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, I hate to bring in the name Woody Allen when we're talking about King David, but someone once asked him, if someone asked me, he said, Woody Allen said, if my dream was to live on after I die in the hearts of the people. And I said, I would prefer to live on in my own apartment. Of course, we would want to live on in our own apartment forever and ever, but that doesn't happen. But King David understood, and Bathsheba understood, that David could live on forever in the Jewish flame of the monarchy of David. And that's why one of the most popular songs of all time is David Melech Yisrael Chai Chai V'Kayam. David, the king of Israel, lives on. Those were Bathsheba's words, and we sing those words till this very day. Because when any one of us take out that book of Tehillim, the book written by King David, and we pour our heart out to God through these prayers, King David lives on. When we live like a royal king, meaning we have Jewish pride, we have dignity, we know that we are a divine prince, King David lives on. When a Jew confesses his most embarrassing mistakes and is ready to repent all of his life, as King David did, King David lives on. When a Jew hopes, when a Jew prays, when a Jew asks and looks out for Mashiach, the king who will be from the lineage of David and from Solomon, and will bring redemption to the world, King David lives on. Leo Tolstoy famously called the Jewish people the embodiment of eternity. And many great thinkers, including Mark Twain, have marveled at the Jewish people's extraordinary ability to survive and wondered, what's the secret? How is it that the Jewish people always survive? How do they know the secret to immortality? And the answer is from what Bathsheba was saying, we have a way of living on if we pass it on to our children, the transmission of our values and practices to the next generation. That's why this week's portion is called The Life of Sarah, even though it focuses after her passing, because together with Abraham, Sarah pioneered the Jewish settlement of the land of Canaan. And as described in the opening parts of this week's portion, her burial in the cave of Machpelah achieved the first actual Jewish purchase and ownership of a piece of land in the Holy Land. Sarah devoted her life to the creation of the first Jewish family. And indeed, the story of Rebekah's selection demonstrates how Sarah's successor embodied the ideals that Sarah set forth. So the true life of Sarah comes to light in the events following her death, when the eternity of her life is revealed. This is the truth of life. A portion of our parents is implanted within us. Unbeknownst to them, they made indelible impressions on us that have been permanently recorded into our very beings. You see, their obituaries of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they don't lie buried in some old newspaper. They're recorded and alive in our hearts and in our souls. In describing death, the Torah frequently uses the phrase, he expired and gathered onto his people. You take a look when it talks about some of the great ones passing away. It will use the word Vayasof al-Amav, gathered onto his people. It says it by Abraham, it says it by Isaac, it says it by Jacob, it says it by David, it says it by Solomon. What's the meaning? He was gathered onto his people. And there's a subtle message that when we die, we don't disappear. We're gathered into the people. That's where we wind up, in people. People wind up in people, not in the ground. The body may be in the ground, but the essence of the person gathered onto the people. They're inside. You can't compare me to my father, says a wise man. Our similarities are different. See, I'm not my father, and your son is not you. But it is our similarities that are different, because we are indeed so similar. Because our parents and our grandparents, they are within us. Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. Sarah lives on. She lives on within every single one of her grandchildren. David Hamelech lives on. All of our great ones live on. And our grandparents and our Zaydis and our Bubbies and our Tatis and our Mommies, they live on through us. And we keep them alive. I do want to make mention in closing that last Shabbos morning, we lost a great one. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was one of the great leaders of the Jewish people of today, chief rabbi of Great Britain, but a great leader for all of the Jewish world. And his works and his writings and his teachings, they will live on. Chaye Sarah, and also the life of Jonathan Sachs, will live on within us, will live on within his teachings and his inspiration for all of eternity. May his neshama have an aliyah, may he go higher and higher in the heavenly worlds, and we should each take upon ourselves to read some of his writings and read some of his books in his memory, especially during the Shloshim, during the 30 days of his passing. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos. I look forward to seeing you either in Shul on Shabbos or Monday evening 7:30 or Wednesday afternoon at 12:30. Shabbat Shalom to all.